Well, hello everyone, it's John Lockland here. I'm the Director of Forum for Democracy International, speaking to you this week from Paris. Delighted to be joined by my co-hosts Peter Lavelle and by George Samueli, Peter Lavelle in Moscow, George in Budapest. And we're immensely honoured and pleased this week to have as our main guest Ali Rizk, a security and political analyst who's joining us from Beirut. Ali, I wanted to start by asking you this, the fog of war, the famous fog of war. Daddy Trump, Daddy was when he was apostrophized by the Secretary General of NATO this morning, 25th of June. Mark Rutte called Donald Trump Daddy. Daddy has announced this morning that the war is over, the 12-day war is over. We're all, of course, coming out of 2 weeks of intense speculation about what was going to happen next. Before we try to work out what's going to happen next, Ali, do you have any reliable information about what was or was not hit during the course of these exchanges of missiles between Israel and Iran, and of course between the United States and Iran? Both sides, of course, minimize their own damage, the damage that was done to their own countries and installations, and concomitantly the other side claims huge levels of destruction. How do you assess it, Ali? How do you assess the actual military nature of this exchange of fire in the last 12 days? Ali?
Actually, it's difficult to make an accurate assessment. I'm not in Iran, neither, of course, am I in Israel. But it's only natural for each side to exaggerate the achievements they made, and for the other side to underestimate the achievements made by the opposing party. Interestingly, there was a statement by the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in the last few hours saying that the damage to the Fordo nuclear reactor was quite extensive. That was in reference to the American strikes, by the way.
Yes.
And I would anticipate that the American strikes did deal significant damage given the type of weaponry, the B-2 bombers, which were used. So the Iranians are admitting that extensive damage has been caused. Regarding the general war, what targets were hit? Obviously, we know that the Israelis took out military leaders, nuclear scientists. They targeted important military bases in Iran. They even targeted civilian areas, by the way. Iran has responded, also targeting Israeli military sites, Israeli military positions. They've also led or caused the home front, the Israeli home front, to come to a standstill. Every day, on multiple times, people going en masse in large numbers to bomb shelters. One important revelation, which I'm sure you saw, is that made by the American Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon Intelligence Agency, which issued an assessment saying that the strike on Fordo didn't lead to full-scale destruction of that particular nuclear site. And I think that coming from the US, from a US intelligence agency, is quite significant in of itself, that despite the use of the B-2 bombers, it's only succeeded in doing so much damage. And many Americans were skeptical, by the way, that even the B-2s would be able to destroy Fordo, including Steve Bannon, who was the former chief White House strategist. So again, it's difficult to say how much damage was caused by either side, but I think that both sides have been dealt some very heavy blows, whether it be Iran, particularly on the first day when it was caught by surprise, or Israel, given that Iran's missiles were able to practically cover all of Israel, all the targets, and hence succeeded in bringing life to a standstill. And I think that probably was a major factor why Israel agreed to this ceasefire.
I'm delighted to see that we're joined by Craig Murray, former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, and since leaving the Foreign Office, tireless campaigner for human rights around the world, particularly in occupied Palestine. Craig, I was just asking Ali for his assessment about what actually, what military damage had actually been done to both sides in this conflict. Ali, how do you treat the claim, which I read from a French commentator this morning, that actually the strikes on Iran were a theatrical coup, that this was just all make-believe. The speculation, I mean, I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but it is that somehow the Iranians may even have been warned in advance and they didn't drop the bunker busters and so on. And that this is all Trump's amazing 5D chess and smoke and mirrors. Does that ring true to you?
Is that question addressed to me?
Yes, please, yes.
That's possible, but the statement coming from Mr. Arakchi, the Iranian foreign minister, appears to contradict that assessment. As I was saying in my previous answer, the Iranian foreign minister, according to the media outlets, said that extensive damage was done to Fordo. I think the more important question, however, is not about Fordo itself, but about what was in Fordo, the stockpiles that were there. It's possible it might have been theatrical in the sense that Iran removed that material beforehand, regardless of how much destruction was done to the actual site. If you look at it from that angle, possibly it was theatrical. Trump wants to promote a narrative that he did something, that he was the first president to strike Iran, to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. You know, for Trump, that's very important, this personal legacy issue and being a person to establish the precedent. So that remains a possibility. We can't be sure, of course. And Iran's response also, I think, to the Central Command base in Al Udeid in Qatar, I think we can also place that in the same framework. It was intended as a symbolic message, but it didn't do material damage or cause losses in life. So I think that both sides had an interest in not causing immense damage to the other. Again, regarding the American-led strikes, it's possible that these were theatrics, that the Iranians were informed earlier on, and that Trump basically did this for his own legacy, number one, and number two, to satisfy the Israelis and the pro-Israelis in Washington and the warmongers in Washington who keep demanding and keep saying or are very enthusiastic to go to war with Iran. This may have been a way in order to silence them or to satisfy their wishes without getting the United States embroiled in a wider war.
Yeah, but that seems that's where I find. I mean, I'd love to believe that, and I'm listening to you with great interest. But it seems incredible or impossible, rather, that the warmongers in Washington and even more so the ones in Israel itself would be satisfied with theatrics. Craig Murray, how do you understand this 12-day war, as Daddy Trump has christened it? Do you understand it to be theatrics, or do you think, as I think we collectively thought when we were on this same show last week, that Trump had indeed finally capitulated to the neocons and to Netanyahu?
I think bits of it are plainly theatric. The Iranian attack on the US army base in Qatar was plainly theatric. They telegraphed that in advance, and they only used older, slow, interceptable missiles. That was a kind of deliberate, not harming anybody as a token retaliation against the United States attack on Iran, I think. So, I mean, theatrics do occur. I think the American attack on Iran was more than theatric, but I think it was token in a sense, in that it was Trump attempting to do a one-off to show he had intervened. And one possible way of looking at this, I think, is that this is Trump's final payoff to the Zionist backers who contributed hundreds of millions to his campaign funds. And a lot of his, I mean, as always with Trump, he's extremely difficult to read. One moment he's talking as though that's it, that's the thing, that's done. It was a huge blow, a huge success, and that's the end of it, and now we're going to have peace. And then on the other hand, he's talking about, continued threats towards Iran in the next breath almost. But I think the basic messaging has been that was a massive one-off triumph and now it's over. And I do wonder whether in his mind this quits him of the debt he owes to those who put hundreds of millions, like the Adelsons have put either 100 or 200 million, I can't remember which, into his campaign funds. Whether in his mind this quits him of that obligation towards them, and now he will have a freer hand in his dealing over Israel going forward.
That would explain why he was so angry going to the NATO summit. Is like, I've done everything. I did my debt's paid. But Ali, you used one word, Ali, that I think is really important here. Trump created a precedent to attack Iran. And I think now creating the precedent means this is part of the mix right now. So it's not a taboo anymore. No, a president has done this, so it could happen again. I don't think any of us think this is really over, do we?
I think it's important here to point out to the Iranian response. I would have to slightly disagree with Mr. Murray about Iran's response. It's true that it was more symbolic in nature than it was intended to do real damage. But I think it was also a message to say that Iran is ready to retaliate should the Americans escalate or become involved in a full-blown war. So I think it would be a mistake to minimize the message which Iran was trying to say or was trying to send. Now, I go here to your question. That's why I think the Americans decided, or the Iranians, decided that they had to respond, because by having this precedent, by Trump launching an attack, for that to go unanswered, that may have encouraged Trump to go even further. And this is where I think the response or the retaliation from Iran was very important. And I think it also possibly played a role in Trump deciding to stand down, because retaliating to Iran's attack on Al-Udeid, the base in Qatar, that very likely would have led to an all-out war. I also want to emphasize something else. I don't think that the warmongers, by the way, and the Israelis are satisfied with how the situation has turned out. I don't think that the Israelis or the warmongers, people like Lindsey Graham or Tom Cotton or the Adelsons, which were mentioned, I don't think they wanted to stop here with a strike on Fordo or Isfahan or Natanz. I think what they wanted in the end was regime change. So Netanyahu succeeded on two fronts. Number one, he succeeded in getting the green light for an Israeli attack. You remember that initial attack, the one which caught Iran by surprise. And the second time in getting Trump to launch the attacks on the 3 nuclear sites. But the third and the most important, which was to get Trump involved in regime change, that's where Netanyahu failed. So I think that at the end of the day, the warmongers aren't satisfied, regardless of the fact that Trump established this precedent and went ahead and launched these strikes.
This is why this is very reminiscent to what happened after Gulf War I, when there was, George H.W. Bush's very narrow goals, which was the liberation of Kuwait, but nothing further, no regime change in Baghdad. But there was the Israel lobby that was obviously supporting the war, but they didn't want to stop there. They wanted regime change in Baghdad, which they got 12 years later. And I think something similar is happening. And that's why this report from the Defense Intelligence Agency, I think, is so significant. They're already laying the groundwork for the next war. They're saying, hey, well, very little damage has already been done. I mean, Iran could just simply restore its nuclear weapons program within a few months. And this is now going to be repeated and repeated and repeated by Lindsey Graham, by Tom Cotton, by Mark Levin. It's laying the groundwork now for the fact, hey, we have to go further. We can't just stop here. We have to do regime change. Trump mooted that issue. Oh, let's do regime change. And then he went back on it and said, no, I don't want to do it. But he has, in a way, kind of brought this up. So I think this is really just the first step for a long campaign. That doesn't mean it's going to happen next week, next month, or next year, but it's laying the groundwork for the next attack on Iran.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
You can take that from a different angle. I don't think that the DIA's report was politicized as a way to encourage further war. I think this in my humble opinion, was an accurate assessment. Again, many people express skepticism that even the B-2s were going to destroy Fordo even before the attack actually took place. So it's very likely this is an accurate assessment. It might play out in the way which was just explained, but on the other hand, it could be just proof that air power alone can't destroy these sites, can't destroy Iran's nuclear program. And that would be perhaps a motivation for Trump to resort to diplomacy. Because we all know, I think we can all agree that Trump isn't going to commit ground troops to Iran.
But could I just add to your point is that, yes, that may have been a good faith attempt to do an assessment. Very interesting that it was leaked already to the CNN and New York Times. Why would they leak to CNN and New York Times rather than just leave it in-house and say, okay, well, let's think about it, let's do it. The fact that they leaked it right away would indicate that there was some political motive behind it.
Oh, look, anything's possible. I mean, but not all leaks can be linked to some kind of conspiracy to get a president involved. Again, it's possible, the point you're raising. But once again, I repeat, there were even doubts before this attack took place because Fordo is buried so much underground that even this immense weaponry won't be successful. So let's wait and see. I think the time will tell whether or not that is a plan by the deep state, for example, to get the United States embroiled in a war.
Yeah, but Trump already is involved. That's the precedent that has been set. If he bombed once, it can easily happen again. And plus that could be part of the gambit. Ultimately, I think the goal is regime change. That's exactly what they want, because you change the regime, then you don't have to worry about an alleged nuclear weapons program. Craig, do you think, I previously said this isn't over. You would agree?
Yeah. If I can recap on a couple of points. I agree very much with what Ali said earlier. The Iranians actually announced, it wasn't much noticed, but they made a public statement about 2 days before the American bombing saying that they had moved the enriched petroleum out of Fordo and the other sites and had dispersed it. And I think there's probably quite a lot of truth in that. I expect a lot of their existing plutonium stock, enriched plutonium stock, is safe somewhere, irrespective of the degree of damage at Fordo. Secondly, my understanding is that reconstructing and building new sites to continue enrichment is not a massive decade-long process. That they would be able to get, even if there is quite extensive damage to existing facilities, their ability to get new facilities up and running within a time scale of months or days or a year or so is quite strong. But whatever's happened, it's not the end of Iran's nuclear program should they wish to continue it. And the fact they have now said that they will pull out of the NPT and the International Atomic Energy Authority would give them the ability to do that, of course, without supervision. And given that Israel is a member of neither of those and has nuclear weapons, of course, it'd be very difficult to blame them for that. Yes, there's no doubt that the deep state, if you like, the intelligence services and the lobby of hawks in general want regime change in Iran and would like to push Trump towards that. And I tend to agree it is probable that was the intention, that the getting further American involvement was the intention of those who released the assessment, because that is undermining Trump's narrative. Trump is claiming a great victory, and they are undermining Trump in leaking that assessment. Trump will have been told, undoubtedly, by the professionals that to obtain regime change in Iran would be a major, major military operation and would, of necessity, involve ground troops. You're not going to bomb Iran into regime change. And although you may get online war hawks or media hawks who argue that is possible. It's not actually possible in the real world. In fact, there's a great deal of evidence that the bombing campaign has consolidated support for the regime in Iran. I can't see Trump committing to regime change in Iran, but that has been a long-term goal of certain interests in the American state is of course true, and will continue to be a long-term goal of those interests. But I do think Trump is attempting to bow out and sign off and say, I've done my bit. Because I don't think this is an entanglement he wants to continue. I do think I do actually think it's genuine that he is less of an instinctive imperialist than other recent US presidents. He has a great many faults. I'm by no means a fan of Trump, but I don't think involvement in a major war in Iran is something which he wants. And I think we are genuinely seeing a desire on his part to declare victory and pull out.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear, because we were all plunged in pessimism this time last week, convinced of the opposite, that he had been in fact hijacked, not just by the American deep state, but of course by the Israelis, by the Likudniks and so on. And it seemed we more or less reached the opposite conclusion this time last week. But I agree that the developments of the last 24 hours or so do lend your interpretation, Craig, some credence.
But John, if they could do it once, why can't they do it again?
Well, I fully agree they can do it again, and I take the point about the precedent. But we're here. We are trying to read the crystal ball, aren't we? And trying to guess what the child man's next move is going to be. What is next?
And what does this ceasefire mean? I mean, not to lob missiles at each other. Does that preclude the United States going after?
I don't think the ceasefire between Iran and Israel will necessarily last. I didn't mean to say that. But that's different from saying that the United States will again get involved in a major way. And the United States will continue to do things like try to help shoot down Iranian missiles, for example. But I don't think we'll see further major direct American attacks on Iran. I would be surprised if we saw that coming. And I take what Ali said on board about the deterrent effect of the token Iranian attack on Qatar.
When you ask about why the US wouldn't do it again, I think that the attack on Qatar, that was the perfect opportunity for Trump to pursue further military action if he really wanted to. So I think that the muted reaction from Trump to the Qatar operation, I think that proves that Trump is not interested in getting further involved. And everything was there, the perfect circumstances. An attack on the base. Iran is perceived to be weaker, given the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, given the blows which were dealt to Hezbollah, etc. That's why Netanyahu was so keen. He saw this as a golden opportunity to pursue his long-standing dream of getting rid of the government in Iran. He also had, by the way, an important ally in Eric Kurilla, who is the head of US Central Command and who shares with the Israelis this enthusiasm. So everything was there to pursue that dream, but Trump didn't follow through. The attack on the Al-Udaid, that should have been seen, or that could have been seized upon as the opportunity to go ahead. He didn't. That's why I'm skeptical that the United States is going to once again escalate or launch strikes. And that's why I also say that Netanyahu has emerged, in my humble opinion, as the biggest loser out of this war, because he had pinned his hopes on there being this golden opportunity to get rid of the government with the US being on board fully, and he failed in doing that. So Netanyahu, I think he's the one who is very much frustrated as to how the situation evolved.
But this is why people like Netanyahu and the Israel lobby, they play the long game. Trump is only going to be there for another 3 years. And that's why I brought up the example of Gulf War I and Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had been defeated, crushed, humiliated. He was under sanction. he was finished. But not to the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby obsessed about Saddam Hussein throughout the 1990s, and they kept pressing and pressing and pressing for the ouster of Saddam Hussein. Something like this, I think, will occur. Now, I agree that I don't think Trump is the one who's going to go any further. I think he'll say, we won, that's it, I don't want to do any more. But the next man in is a different case. And I think the Israel lobby, and that's Netanyahu and whoever comes after Netanyahu, they don't give up. And they're not going to give up on removing the regime in
Well,
Tehran.
George,
that's the way they operate.
That's why Iran will go for the bomb, for the reasons you just said.
I have to emphasize, I think that it goes beyond individuals. American-Israeli interests, by the way, are not identical. And I think that the more we go into the future, the more the interests are diverging. Remember Obama, one of his motivations to reach the deal with Iran was because he didn't want Iran to become part of what they call the Eastern Bloc, led by Russia and China. Obama had his pivot to Asia as well. And so he wanted to achieve some kind of a rapprochement with Iran to focus elsewhere. So the new dynamics, the beginning of the multipolar world, that's changed American priorities. And now American priorities don't require, or the last thing they need is a war with Iran. So strategically speaking, I think the issue goes beyond individuals. It's more about an increasing divergence between American and Israeli interests. And I think what caused that divergence were the wars which were launched by George W. Bush on Afghanistan, particularly in Iraq, and the rise of China. These are dynamics, I think, which give you a broader picture and reflect the fact that it's not about Trump or about Netanyahu. Trump might have more anti-war instincts, but generally speaking, the strategic interests of America and Israel are increasingly diverging.
Yeah, that assumes that foreign policy is made on the basis of interests. I'm usually struck by how foreign policy is instead made on the basis of ideology. And there can surely be no clearer example of this than in the extreme Zionism of American foreign policy going back decades. That seems to me to be an ideological position, which is not consistent with, and in some case, maybe even contradicts American interests.
No,
I wish that it goes for Europe as well. I wish that countries would think in terms of interests, but they, for goodness sake, in Europe, the European decisions are absolutely contrary to European interests, and the Americans seem to be in the same ideological trap.
No, I would agree with you. George W. Bush is a perfect example of ideological-driven foreign policy. When he went to Iraq, he designated Saddam Hussein as the ultimate evil. So yes, American policies are often driven by ideology. But what I'm trying to say is that as we enter the multipolar world, I think it's becoming clearer, this divergence of interest between both sides. And maybe it depends on the figure which politician realizes it and is willing to follow through on what serves American interests best. Maybe here Trump is a better choice than others compared to people like Kamala Harris or other figures. But remember that Obama is the exact ideological opposite of Trump. But he adopted a policy which seems to be quite similar to Trump's policy regarding wanting to reach a deal with Iran.
Craig,
is that possible now?
Yeah.
Craig Murray, go ahead.
Yeah. I've got a question I want to put particularly to George, but I'd welcome comments from others as well. But before I do that, I'd just say that I think it's interesting how often ideology, which appears to be against the interests of a state, but which they are acting in, is actually in the interests of the ruling class of the state, but against the interests of society more generally in the state. And I think that's. I think there are a lot of people who make a lot of money out of the Zionist stance.
That's right. Ideology always serves power, yes.
In many, many different ways, and of course out of the armaments industry and that kind of thing. What I'm trying to be an optimist, as I am increasingly trying to do. I wonder, George, is there any chance, do you think, that we are seeing, normally I would agree with everything you just said about, well, they play the long term, Trump will go, and what comes next will probably be someone like, and I tend to think that, this situation would be worse if Kamala Harris was there. She'd be more likely to get into a full-fledged war with Iran, just as I was actually quite pleased when Trump was elected the first time, because I was convinced that Hillary Clinton would immediately destroy Syria were she elected. But I just wonder whether there is a chance of change, because the horror of the genocide in Gaza has brought about a fundamental and permanent step change in American public attitudes to Israel, because we're seeing opinion poll statistics I would never have thought we would see in terms of Israeli public opinion and whether they tend to favor the Israeli narrative or the Palestinian narrative. And even in the United States of America, we are seeing now majorities in favor of the Palestinian narrative. And of course, today we have this primary election for the Democrat candidate in New York City, who's almost certainly going to become the mayor, who is a Muslim who took huge hits from AIPAC, who put hundreds of millions of dollars into trying to stop him being elected, in an extremely Zionist city, and who nevertheless won, which I would again have thought impossible a few years ago. And I'm just wondering whether that New York, a special place, but whether there is a possibility that the horror of the Gaza genocide is having sufficient of an effect on US public opinion that the inevitability of support for Israel can no longer be taken as absolutely certain.
And Craig, I'd like to point out that New York City is the second largest population of Jews in the world, and younger Jews voted for the Muslim socialists.
However, Andrew Cuomo won in Upper East Side, Upper West Side, where the more prosperous Jews live. I mean, it's possible. I mean, Craig, that things could change, but it's hard to see any real evidence of this as yet. I mean, if you just look at the elected representatives in Congress, overwhelmingly still mouth the same slogans, and there is a real crackdown on any kind of dissent on the subject of Israel. So it's becoming even harsher now than ever, that if you criticize Israel, it's just automatic. This is anti-Semitic and therefore liable for any kind of punishment. And this goes in the most important and powerful institutions. If they find out that you took part in some pro-Palestinian demonstration at Columbia University, well, forget about getting a job at any of the prestigious law firms. Forget about getting a job at any Wall Street firm. So it's becoming harsher and harsher, the repression of dissent on the subject of Israel. Now, maybe it will change, but I have to say it's going to take a long time. As things stand now, whoever is the next man, who's going to follow Trump is going to still mouth the same slogans about Israel. What happens after then, I don't know. But at the moment, I don't see any real change.
Did you see Trump's statements after the ceasefire when there were violations? This time, he didn't say Israel has a right to defend itself, which is a term commonly used by American presidents. He laid the blame at Israel more than he did at Iran, which was very interesting. And would he have done that were it not for this new environment in America where Israel is becoming more and more hated by the American public? Has that contributed to an American president daring to speak out against Israel and changing the discourse? I think that's also a point which should be shed light on.
I think it was much more, I mean, that's possible, but I think it's much more that Trump had already announced the ceasefire, and he was trumpeting that he Trump, is the great peacemaker. And, Netanyahu did what he always does, which is ignore any ceasefires, ignore any demands on him, and just went ahead and say, yeah, we're going to just, dump the biggest payload ever on Iran. And that infuriated Trump because it was making him look like a fool. I think that's why he was so angry rather than anything else about Israel.
Well, I think that was part of it, but I also think that that taboo on criticizing Israel is gradually eroding or collapsing. And I think you're going to see more of it. Even some of Trump's actions, by the way, not just his words, when he reached the agreement with Ansar Allah, the Yemeni movement, to stop the attacks on the ships. That agreement didn't include Israel. When he announced the talks with Iran, Netanyahu was sitting beside him in the Oval Office. So a lot of these actions also reflect that divergence. Again, I think that...
Can I ask you the question? If that's the case, why didn't Trump then sign a deal with Iran, the sort of JCPOA 2.0, which we all thought that's where we're heading? There seems to be an agreement between the two sides, and he was getting annoyed with Netanyahu, who's continually badgering him to use force against Iran. So why didn't he do it? Why did he join Netanyahu in this attack on Iran?
Well, that's a good question. According to Politico, a few days before the Israeli strike, he met with Mark Levin, and Mark Levin had told him that you shouldn't only not reach an agreement with Iran, you should give Israel the green light. Now, did he succumb to pressures from the Israeli lobby, or was he convinced? Did they succeed in convincing him that if you allow the Israelis to launch this attack, Iran is going to come begging to the negotiating table and give you whatever you want? And Trump isn't, I don't think he has a very deep knowledge about the region. He might have been convinced, he might have been pressured. There are various explanations. A lot of the Republicans in Congress are warmongers who don't want an agreement with Iran. That might have factored in as well. But I think that how the situation unfolded yesterday, I think it shows that Trump is now tilting towards the J.D. Vance camp, rather than the opposing camp, which is represented by Levin and by perhaps Marco Rubio. But it's difficult to say exactly why he had that change of heart after he was enthusiastic for talks. Then he gave the Israelis the green light. I just gave some possibilities, but God knows how he had that change of mind, and then he went back to a ceasefire, and once again he's keen on talks.
Craig Murray, what are the possibilities of negotiations moving forward? I mean, because what we have now, we're kind of suspended in air. The ceasefire, nothing has been resolved. All sides are claiming victory. This moment can't last forever. A hat tip to George could last a long time, but nothing has been resolved.
I don't think this moment of quiet will last for 4 weeks. But again, as I say, I don't expect to see direct US involvement again. I mean, it's very hard. I have no idea. I mean, we're all trying to read the minds of people who don't think like we do. Yeah. Donald Trump does not think like we do. An Iranian Ayatollah does not think like we do.
George and I came up with the phrase "the fallacy of common sense." See, we're the fallacy of common sense.
Our ability to predict any of these people, and Netanyahu certainly does not think like we. Our ability to predict the next move of any of these people is not great. If I was Iran, I certainly would not enter negotiations, because every time they enter negotiations, they get bombed. So I think that would be an extremely foolish thing to do. If I was Iran, I would set about developing a nuclear weapon as fast as I can and restocking my ballistic missile stocks. But that's what I would recommend the Iranians to do, if you ask me. And I presume the Israelis are desperately trying to repair and refurbish their anti-missile systems. So I assume those are my suspicion is that Iran doesn't have a huge volume of viable missiles left at the moment. Certainly, if they were to continue, they would be eating into the reserves of what they would want to have at hand if they were to actually face a major ground offensive or truly existential threat. My suspicion is Iran doesn't want further to eat into it missile stocks at the moment, and that's why they stopped. And my suspicion is that Israelis' missile defenses are fairly buggered because these wonderful technical pieces of equipment just don't work at full capacity for 2 weeks without breaking down, or as we saw, destroying themselves, running out of missiles, all the things that can happen. So I think there's probably an element of literal exhaustion in munitions on both sides, which lie behind this mutual ceasefire. We may see negotiations restart. I think the Iranians are quite likely to return to negotiations with EU figures, but I should say I think to date the Iranians have negotiated in reasonably good faith. I think it's unlikely if they do re-enter negotiations, it will be in such good faith because they've been shown such bad faith themselves. And I suspect it does seem plain that Iran has never developed a nuclear weapon, and that they were in fact genuine in not moving forward to that final stage. Whether or not that was a genuine religious opinion by Ayatollah Khomeini, as he claimed it's un-Islamic and apparently issued a fatwa. I don't imagine that's something you can do lightly, and it seems to me something that would be very hard to reverse. But were it not for that religious element, my expectation would be is that what happens next is there's a period when Iran pretends to be negotiating while actually developing a nuclear weapon as fast as it possibly can. That's certainly what I would do were I they, but I don't know.
Good. Could I just ask, Ali or anyone else who has an answer? Now, there is the question of what happened to that enriched uranium. I don't know how many, 400 kilos or whatever. Now, if there are to be any negotiations with the IAEA, and the IAEA says we want to start negotiations, the negotiations will be concerning those that 400 kilos of enriched uranium. What happens to that? Will there be an expectation on Iran that you better hand it over, give it to Russia, give it to Europe or whatever? I'm not sure that they're just going to be able to negotiate and say, well, we're just going to keep it for a rainy day. I think that any negotiation will involve they're handing everything over to them. Otherwise, what's there to negotiate?
I would argue, and you might disagree with me here, but I would argue that Iran is now in a better position to negotiate, and Trump has placed himself in a corner. The reason I say that is that a lot of what's being written and said is that what the Israelis did and what the Americans did is going to push Iran closer to become a nuclear weapon state. They're going to intensify their efforts at doing that. I think the last thing Trump wants is for Iran to become a nuclear weapon state under his watch. You know that Trump focuses a lot on his own legacy, on how he'll go down in the history books. So he wants to avoid that scenario. And I think Iran knows that he wants to avoid that scenario and is probably going to use that in future talks with the US. So Iran could be actually better positioned to make Trump possibly make some concessions about uranium enrichment, no longer insist on zero enrichment, etc., but to put in place a mechanism which would guarantee that Iran doesn't go for the weapon. So the way that Trump has supported Israel here has backfired against his own interest, because as he said time and again, that his ultimate goal is for Iran not to have nuclear weapons. And what has happened now is that the likelihood of that has actually increased. One final point about the fatwa. Don't underestimate how important that is religiously. It's a very, very important step ideologically And it's not something like to cover up for some hidden activities. No, this represents a real, genuine ideological commitment not to go in that direction. And ironically, if Ayatollah Khamenei is out of the picture, that would also increase the possibility that Iran would race for the bomb. Maybe that's why Trump insisted on Ayatollah Khamenei also not being targeted.
But Ali, also to finish off what you were saying in the first part of the scenario that you were presenting, Iran could use the demand of sanction relief, because let's remember, this goes all the way back to getting the sanctions done away with. This is what Iran wanted. They went down this path to use that as leverage, having a potential weapons program for sanction relief. And that is something that they're not will not give up on, and they're very desperate to see them go away. So I'm agreeing with Ali. I think Iran's in a stronger position now, and that is going to have to be a very important part of their negotiating position. And the West is going to have to take it seriously.
But I don't see how Trump would have now absolutely said the one thing, not regime change, nothing. One thing is Iran cannot have enriched uranium. It cannot enrich uranium, and it cannot have any enriched uranium in any form whatsoever on Iranian soil. So I don't know how there can be any negotiation given Trump's demand that there be no enriched uranium. So I mean, what are they going to negotiate about?
Well, with George, he talked about regime change, and the next day he wasn't talking about regime change. And again, how do you parse his words? I agree with you. It's the record. But go ahead, Ali.
Yeah. No, remember that at the start of the talks, the US administration was actually open to the idea of uranium enrichment, about 3-point-something%. Steve Witkoff even said this. That zero enrichment is not an American demand as much as it's an Israeli demand. So Trump might be flexible. He may entertain the idea of Iran having some level of enrichment if that would guarantee that it doesn't come to possess nuclear weapons under his watch.
But Ali, could it possibly, when thinking, and Craig, I think you should jump in here, we've been using the IAEA as the mechanism, as the proxy to deal with this. I'm going to say something really crazy here. And Trump, it's a way to get around the Israelis. The United States and Iran deal with each other directly. And instead of having to have Israeli input, Trump can say, look, let's just negotiate directly. I know they've tried it before, but this is something I truly believe that the Iranians at one point will say, and given the word good faith here, that is a possibility, because that's a way of getting around this enrichment level. Yeah, I mean, correct me, gentlemen, the JCPOA, that allowed enrichment at a low level. Okay, so we've been here before.
I think, Iran has said in the last day or two, but it is leaving the IAEA.
Yes.
And we'll see if it sticks to that. That would necessitate what you say in a sense. It's also, Iran's also in a stronger position in another way as well. Everybody seems to agree that it had, I think, 400 kilos of 60% enriched uranium. And nobody now knows where that is, whereas 2 weeks ago, everybody knew exactly where it is. And not only that, because of the American bombing, it's going to be impossible, I imagine, to determine how much of it still exists, where it is, and whether it was destroyed or not. So, the Iranians have a much greater ability to claim to have none while keeping it hidden somewhere. If the secrecy of their program has been enhanced by this American action. And so we may well see going forward an American-Iranian agreement where, for the sake of appearances for Trump in particular, the Iranians agree that they won't have any enriched beyond 3.6% or something along those lines. But actually are sitting on 200 kilos of it that they've hidden somewhere. That also is an option in the real world.
But I think secrecy will be very, very hard for Iran to go with, because, as I said at the beginning, I think there's a drumbeat starting in Washington that we haven't finished the job of. We need to finish the job of. But if there's any evidence of secrecy, and particularly if Iran starts moving towards leaving the non-proliferation treaty, I think that that will absolutely guarantee that force will again be used against Iran. So Iran really can't really maneuver around us to secrecy and walk out of the non-proliferation treaty. Any suggestion that they're going to leave the NPT,
yeah, but George, what is
by force?
What does force mean then?
Again, bombing, and bombing.
But they've already said it, George. They've already plainly said they're leaving the NPT and leaving the IAEA.
They have that's the Iranian parliament. That they don't make the decisions. It's the decision of the Supreme Council of Iran. They're the ones who make the decision. They haven't made that decision. It's just the parliament. Parliament doesn't matter.
But what does bombing accomplish? Air power. What can it accomplish?
Well, I think ultimately it's to undermine the authority of the government. But I think the bombing will probably go together with all kinds of other activities, creating all sorts of irredentist movements, ethnic movements. They're going to try and create as many problems as possible for the government, much as they did with Saddam Hussein. Again, you remember they created the sort of Shiite state in the south, they created the Kurdish state in the north, and continued to bomb. I mean, throughout the 90s, they would bomb Saddam Hussein on a regular basis. It was just a way of weakening and undermining. And of course, the sanctions will remain. The sanctions will snap back in place in October to do with the JCPOA. So Iran will continue to be punished by sanctions.
The analogy between Iran and Iraq, Saddam was a very unpopular leader amongst the Iraqis. I don't think that applies to the Iranian people. In fact, as was said in this program, the Iranian people are now rallying around, and the sectarian diversity in Iraq, which could be taken advantage of, doesn't exist in Iran. It's a very high majority of Shias. It's true you do have in Baluchistan, elsewhere, some separatist movements that could be taken advantage of, but to pursue or to try and execute such a mission, I think it's going to be much more difficult in Iran compared to Iraq.
Go ahead, George.
That it may be difficult. That doesn't mean that they're not going to try it. That's just all I say. I think they will try it. I'm not saying that it's going to succeed, but I think this is going to be the project for the next 5-10 years. You've heard Lindsey Graham. He's on the floor of the Senate almost every day talking about the Nazis, Hitler. You can't negotiate with Hitler. You can't have ceasefires with Hitler. You can't leave Hitler in place. This is just going to continue. It doesn't stop with the United States. It doesn't stop.
Yeah, but there's one thing I know we're rapidly running out of time, but there's one thing we haven't mentioned, which I think is really important, is that the MAGA movement and the messages that were being telegraphed to Trump. I think that personally, until we get the confirmation from what really happened over the last 12, 14 days, is that I think Trump chickened out. I think he realized, I promised my donors I would do something about Iran. For God's sake, I bombed them. Nobody else had ever done that before. I paid my debt to those people, but I can't lose. I can't lose my base, because after the midterms, if and for a lot of other reasons, if the Republicans are in the minority, and George knows this better than anyone else, the first thing on the agenda is to impeach the man, and they may have the numbers this time. Okay. Because Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, Trump always choked. They came up with the term. He's worried about his base, and he should be. John, you're agreeing with me.
Yeah, I do agree with you. And I also agree with with what Craig said a few moments ago, asking George about the sea change in public opinion over the Gaza genocide. And George, you replied that there would be repression. Well, yes, of course there's repression, but of course repression, the clamping down on free speech in universities and so on, that's very un-American. So I think that I would have thought that the repression itself would surely only encourage such a sea change. And that sea change undoubtedly exists in America and also, of course, in Europe. And I just add perhaps one last comment. Of all the crazy things, I mean, Trump, as we know, Craig, you said a moment ago, these people don't think like us, or we don't think like them. He literally said this morning in The Hague, he said something, I've forgotten the exact words, but it was something like, oh, by the way, we're talking to the Iranians and they're being very nice to us. He said it this morning, 25th of June. Now, he may have simply invented it. It's quite possible. We can't put it past him. But that would, if there were to be some truth behind this extraordinary statement, that would imply that indeed perhaps this notion of a direct negotiation between Iran and the Americans is on the cards. I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much, Craig Murray and Ali Rizk. It's been a great pleasure having you on the show. George, Peter, see you again next week. Thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.